The first days of November 1940 bring bitter cold to the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. At the Krupp steelworks near Essen, workers have begun the daily ritual that sustains Germany's war machine, shoveling coal into massive furnaces that never sleep. The black dust hangs in the air like fog. The roar of the fires drowns out almost everything else. A man checks the thermometer mounted on the brick wall. The furnace temperature has begun to drop. Someone somewhere nearby has ordered more coal. A lorry rumbles through the compound gates, joining dozens of others. No one thinks to question it. No one thinks to inspect it. By evening, nothing remains of the warehouse but smoking rubble and the bodies of men who were simply doing their jobs. The British had found a way to turn Germany's greatest resource into a weapon that could strike without warning, without sound, without mercy. They had weaponized coal itself. This story begins not with innovation born of necessity, but with a calculated campaign of industrial sabotage that would reshape how modern warfare could be waged. The question that occupied the minds of British strategists in 1940 was elegantly simple, yet extraordinarily difficult to answer. How do you destroy a nation's industrial capacity when conventional bombing has proven unreliable, expensive, and surprisingly ineffective? The Germans had prepared for air raids. They had dispersed their factories. They had built shelters. They had learned to rebuild, but they had not prepared for the enemy to arrive in their coal supply. The coal bomb represented something new in warfare, a weapon that relied on deception rather than force, on the normal functioning of industrial systems rather than their destruction. It was, in essence, a Trojan horse fashioned from iron and explosive compounds hidden within the very substance that kept the German war machine alive. By the autumn of 1940, Germany's industrial output had become dependent on a staggering supply chain. The Third Reich required approximately 40 million tons of coal per year to fuel its factories, power stations, railways, and domestic heating. The Ruhr Valley supplied roughly 60% of this demand. Every day, hundreds of lorries and railway wagons moved coal from the mines to the industrial facilities scattered across western Germany. It was a rhythm of logistics so established, so routine, that it had become virtually invisible to German security apparatus. The coal moved because it always had moved. No one questioned the coal. The coal simply arrived, was shoveled into furnaces, and turned to ash. This assumption of safety, this belief that the supply chain was essentially untouchable, represented perhaps the single greatest vulnerability in the German industrial economy. The British intelligence services had identified it, studied it, and began to contemplate how they might exploit it. The existing methods of striking at German industry had already proven inadequate. Conventional bombing raids, whilst dramatic and destructive in their immediate effects, could be repaired. A bombed factory could be rebuilt. Damaged machinery could be replaced. Killed workers could be replaced by others conscripted from occupied territories. The RAF's early attempts to cripple German war production through aerial bombardment had consumed enormous resources while delivering results that disappointed military planners. The Americans, who would eventually join the war, would discover this same bitter truth at tremendous cost. What was needed was something that could not simply be rebuilt, something that struck at the integrity of the production process itself rather than merely damaging buildings and equipment. The idea that emerged from this strategic puzzle was radical: hide explosives inside coal, distribute them through normal supply channels, and allow the Germans themselves to deliver these devices directly into the heart of their most vital installations. The solution was developed by the Royal Engineers and refined through a combination of practical engineering and careful psychological study of how coal was actually handled in German industrial facilities. The weapon came to be known by various names: the coal bomb, the bomb coal, occasionally simply the coal, but the principle was consistent. What was created was a roughly spherical object, approximately 20 centimeters in diameter, weighing between 3 and 4 kilograms, manufactured to closely resemble a piece of anthracite coal, but constructed from cast iron, filled with explosive material. The exterior was coated with a thin layer of actual coal dust and powered coal to provide authentic coloring and texture. When handled in darkness, when inspected by touch alone, when glimpsed in the chaos of a busy colliery or warehouse, it passed without suspicion. The deception was meticulous. The weight was within the normal distribution for pieces of coal that size. The shape was irregular, natural. The color was correct. Even the sound it made when struck against metal or stone was close enough to genuine coal that observers noticed nothing amiss. The interior construction revealed the true ingenuity of the design. The cast-iron shell was approximately 8 millimeters thick, providing sufficient strength to contain the explosive force whilst remaining thin enough not to compromise the weight authenticity. Inside this shell, the engineers had packed around 1.2 kilograms of explosive material, typically amatol, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and TNT that was relatively stable and required a specific trigger mechanism to detonate. The detonator was a simple but effective device that could be set to trigger either on impact or through a time delay mechanism. The time delay versions were particularly insidious because they allowed the coal to be shoveled into furnaces, burned for a period of time, and then detonate when it had moved deeper into the industrial process, potentially damaging equipment that would have survived a surface explosion. The manufacturing process was carried out at several locations, primarily at facilities in southern England where security could be maintained and production could be coordinated with RAF operations. Production numbers remain classified to this day, but conservative estimates based on declassified documents suggest that somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 coal bombs were manufactured throughout the war, with production peaking in 1942 and 1943. The challenge of getting these devices into the German coal supply chain required a different sort of ingenuity altogether. The RAF could not simply bomb coal supplies with them. That would alert the Germans to the danger. Instead, the coal bombs were routed through occupied territories, particularly the Netherlands and Belgium, where they were introduced into legitimate coal shipments destined for German factories. Railway workers and coal handlers, many of whom were sympathetic to the Allied cause or working under duress for resistance organizations, would mix the coal bombs into larger consignments. The devices would then travel through normal supply channels, often for weeks, until they arrived at their intended targets. This approach required extraordinary coordination. Someone had to plant the coal bombs. Someone had to ensure that specific shipments reached specific facilities. Someone had to maintain records of where bombs had been planted so that the intelligence services could subsequently assess whether they had detonated. The operation was not, therefore, something improvised by a few enthusiasts, but rather a carefully structured campaign involving multiple intelligence services, the RAF, railway workers across occupied Europe, and coordination with local resistance groups who could sometimes provide information about which shipments were destined for strategically important targets. The operational record of the coal bomb campaign reveals something quite different from what one might initially imagine. The devices were not responsible for mass casualties in the way that conventional bombing was, nor were they responsible for the complete destruction of German industrial capacity. Rather, they operated as a form of psychological and operational harassment that created persistent uncertainty in German logistical and security operations. When a coal bomb detonated in a furnace at a steelworks near Cologne in January 1942, it destroyed the furnace itself and killed 17 workers, but it also triggered a security crisis. German authorities were forced to confront the possibility that their coal supply was compromised. Were other bombs already in the supply chain? How many? Where had they been planted? How could they be detected? The response from German security apparatus was dramatic and disruptive. Inspections of coal supplies were intensified. Security around coal storage facilities was increased. Suspect coal shipments were quarantined and inspected piece by piece, a process that was extraordinarily labor-intensive and that disrupted the normal flow of supplies to industrial facilities. One documented case involved the inspection of a 12-ton coal delivery that required 3 days of manual examination piece by piece before it was deemed safe to use. The psychological impact was perhaps more significant than the material damage. Workers became nervous about their workplace. Managers became anxious about their coal supplies. The absolute certainty that the supply chain was secure had been shattered. And in wartime, uncertainty is itself a weapon. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It allows us to continue producing these documentaries and researching the historical details that bring these stories to life. The comparison between the British coal bomb and German and American approaches to sabotage and incendiary weapons reveals important distinctions in strategic thinking. The Germans had experimented with their own incendiary devices and had attempted to develop sabotage weapons, but these efforts were largely directed outward against Allied targets and were considerably less sophisticated. The Americans, by contrast, had developed the firebomb, a much larger and more destructive incendiary device, but this was designed as an aerial weapon meant to be dropped from aircraft rather than infiltrated through supply chains. The firebomb was effective but crude, relying on sheer destructive force rather than deception. The British coal bomb represented a fundamentally different approach. It was intimate, deceptive, and it exploited the structure of the enemy's own logistics system. Where the American approach said, "We will overwhelm you with force," the British approach said, "We will make you afraid of your own supplies." The coal bomb was also considerably more efficient in terms of the effort required to deliver it. A 4-kilogram coal bomb required virtually no military apparatus to transport. It simply rode along in a coal train, undetected and unremarkable. A 1,000-kilogram bomb dropped from an RAF Lancaster required an aircraft worth millions, a trained crew, fuel, and exposed the aircraft to defensive fire. For the resources invested, the coal bomb achieved a disproportionate effect on German morale and security procedures. The actual impact of the coal bomb campaign remains, by necessity, somewhat obscured by the fog of war and by the classified nature of much of the operational record. Conservative estimates suggest that documented coal bomb detonations killed somewhere between 60 and 170 workers and caused damage to industrial facilities valued at several million marks, substantial but not decisive. What is clearer is the effect on German security thinking and on the efficiency of industrial operations. The systematic checking of coal supplies diverted labor and attention from production. The anxiety created within the workforce manifested in measurable ways, from increased absenteeism to higher accident rates in plants where coal bomb incidents had occurred. In this regard, the coal bomb succeeded at something that conventional bombing often failed to achieve. It created a persistent source of fear and disruption that could not be simply rebuilt or repaired. You could rebuild a destroyed factory, but you could not easily restore confidence in your supply chain once it had been compromised. The surviving examples of coal bombs, a handful preserved in military museums and held in classified archives, reveal them to be genuinely impressive feats of engineering. The casting is precise. The weight distribution is accurate. The deception, even when one knows what to look for, is remarkably effective. They represent the work of engineers who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the largest or the loudest, but the one that exploits the vulnerabilities of the system against which it is directed. The legacy of the coal bomb extended beyond the Second World War itself. The concept of hiding weapons within routine supply items had proven effective, and military theorists and intelligence services took note. The principle that enemy supply chains represented a target as important as the factories themselves became an established element of military doctrine. In subsequent conflicts, both conventional and proxy-based, the idea of infiltrating contaminated supplies into enemy logistical systems reappeared repeatedly. The coal bomb had demonstrated that large-scale industrial capacity could be disrupted not through frontal assault, but through a campaign that undermined confidence in the basic infrastructure of supply and production. Furthermore, the coal bomb represented one of the first systematic attempts to weaponize the products of a nation's own industrial system against that nation, a form of strategic judo where the enemy's strength was turned into a weapon against itself. The campaign also illustrated something important about the nature of intelligence work and sabotage in modern warfare. That victories often consist not of dramatic moments but of persistent, unglamorous disruption that accumulates its effects over time. A single coal bomb detonation was a relatively minor event in the context of a global conflict. But thousands of coal bombs introduced into the German supply system, each one a small source of anxiety and disruption, each one requiring inspection and security procedures, each one a reminder that the supply chain could not be trusted. These accumulated into a real, if measurable, degradation of German industrial efficiency. To stand in a museum today and look at a coal bomb, if one is fortunate enough to encounter one of the few that remain on display, is to recognize something profound about human ingenuity in the service of war. It is a beautiful object in its own way, precise and purposeful. It is also a revelation about the nature of conflict in the industrial age. The Second World War was fought not merely with tanks and airplanes, but with the intimate corruption of the systems upon which modern military capacity depends. The coal bomb represents this perfectly. It is invisible until it detonates. It relies on trust and routine to reach its destination, and it exploits the assumption that certain systems are too large and too established to be vulnerable. We remember the war in terms of grand strategic movements and massive air raids, and indeed these were essential to the eventual victory. But we often overlook the smaller campaigns, the patient infiltration of contaminated supplies, the psychological warfare waged through the disruption of routine. The coal bomb campaign was one such overlooked victory, not dramatic enough to capture headlines, not devastating enough to dramatically shift the course of events, but persistent enough to matter and clever enough to represent an important evolution in how modern warfare could be waged. As Germany struggled to maintain the vast supply chains necessary to sustain its industrial base, as workers became nervous about their workplaces, as security forces scrambled to inspect and re-inspect supplies that had always been trusted, the coal bomb was doing its work. It was not the coal that was doing the burning. It was the coal that was causing the fire. And in a war of industrial attrition, in a war that would be decided by which side could maintain its productive capacity longer than the other, this small act of deception, this Trojan horse of iron and explosive hidden within the legitimate infrastructure of supply, represented a genuine, if quiet, weapon of significance.